Welcome to Capital H. I'm Matthew Shannon, Deloitte's HR Technology Relationships Leader. I'm glad to be joined today by Franz Gilbert, Managing Director at Deloitte, who leads our human capital ecosystems and alliances team globally, as well as Deloitte's human capital strategy and innovation team. We're delighted today to bring the Deloitte human capital perspective on HR market insights. This past year, we've continued to hold a front row seat to the latest developments in HR technology, working with clients, all of our engagements, connecting with providers through hundreds of conversations with them and tracking the shapes and trends affecting our HR technology industry. Amongst all of that exposure, we're today excited to dive into Deloitte's 2026 HR Technology Predictions Report, sharing what excites us about the content, what we're watching closely about coming to fruition, and what those shifts mean for HR leaders as they continue in the year ahead. Let's get started by double-clicking on what the 2026 HR Technology Predictions Report is and why our Deloitte team continues to craft this insight year over year. Franz, 3 years running now. How did this all start?
That's a great question. The fun of it was there's a lot of folks that do kind of HR predictions. There's ones that kind of do it per category. And the beauty is Deloitte, we have some of the top analysts in the world, right? And we have the sincere privilege of talking to literally thousands of providers. And we not only understand what they're doing, but they also behind closed doors share with us what their business strategy is, where their roadmaps are going. And given that we track, it's expanded now. Matt, it's amazing. The team has continued to grow it. So it was 55 and then went to 63. And now we track 68 categories. And so you can imagine how many vendors are in each one of those. And so what we started realizing is, one, you could see some patterns across all the categories, right? So kind of piece number one. So that was kind of driver number one, which is we were seeing things that we thought would drive value. Second is we looked at it from a client perspective, from an HR IT perspective, going, okay, if I'm managing an HR tech stack, what are the things that I need to know, right? And we wanted to bring that lens because we felt like there was a void in the market kind of helping it from that directionality. And then second is, you and I know, we have an amazing ecosystem of providers and founders that also, they're so heads down and making their product and their company work that they may not have the privilege of being able to do what we do. And so as a result, we wanted to share some of those findings that may impact them. And so over time, like this year for everyone, we've got kind of what's the trend, what's the implication for HR and IT, and what's the implication for a provider.
Love that. Tracking back, so we're talking about dozens of client engagements directly related to the HR and IT stacks, and then some of those statistics around how we've elevated the number of categories that we track across the market from 55 to 68 this year. Excited to look at what some of those new 13 categories might be, but also those thousands of providers in the HR tech world and the hundreds that we've had exposure to over the last year, especially on the ground reporting and tracking across industries and conferences. A lot of exposure that informs this report. And I ended that last piece around conferences because the timing of this podcast certainly comes on the heels of our attendance, and not just one of the first major tech conferences of the year, but certainly the largest consumer technology show of the year in CES. As we finish wrapping that event and jump into the report, what are some of your lingering feelings, takeaways from the Consumer Electronics Show?
So one, it's just always amazing to see what's happening. There's just always fun going on in terms of CES. And the biggest takeaway was, one, robots were kind of the centerpiece. Everyone I've talked to were like, robots are here. And there were robots kind of varying types, right? Humanoids, there were ones who picked up toys. They had robot bartenders, they had all sorts of stuff, but robots are here. But the second piece is when we talked to the leading robot firms, not only, you and I talking with them, but we had them on panels and things along those lines, is what was really interesting is those individuals were talking about what made this event so interesting wasn't that the robots were working, right? It wasn't their excitement about the mechanical pieces or the AI piece of it. If you think about the Diligent Robotics, they are in the healthcare world, and their excitement was about how they've made it so they can work in and around humans, and their design factors around how do we help humans do better at their jobs. And when we heard other robot providers, they too were similarly going, we really needed to make and design the robot about humans. And so that was the biggest takeaway for me is what we've learned with generative AI and agentic AI is it's not really about the tech. It's more about what are we doing to make sure that from a human perspective, we're working around it.
I love that and I agree. Certainly hard to miss across the expo floors and all the panel sessions and keynotes. AI felt literally everywhere. And that was one of the themes, everywhere and for all. To tie it back to this report, which I think we've seen over the last 3 years track that space.
Yeah, well, as they say, just as a fun example of AI everywhere, I loved when you and I walked past that one booth and they had a big video screen that they were literally videoing everyone. And then they had an emotion graph saying, this person feels happy, this person feels sad, right? And they were scoring it. And it just gave you some sense of how fast that technology is moving, which is fun. But at the same time, it starts going, at some point, does that become employee listening where, the systems can read you and you don't have to go to an employee engagement survey?
Agreed. Certainly, it may have felt like surveillance of past years actually translating into aspects of understanding the emotion and sentiment and certain things we track in a text perspective, but certainly from a video angle as well. And I think that ties it to the report where over the years, we've tracked those different hype waves of generative, agentic, and as you're describing with robots, now physical AI. I think we start to feel something on the expo floors a little bit different this year. It's not just a top line question of, is something possible with AI, but really, is it practical? I think in tying that to your point around designing for humans, we get to that unique differentiation of, is it actually tangibly valuable? I think it's that practicality piece around the value that brings us to the theme for our predictions this year. And theme, I think, is summarized in 3 anchor terms: humanity, unity, and accountability. And to unpack those, why did we come up with these as an anchor for a report about predictions?
I mean, Matt, this is like your secret sauce, right? You do an amazing job kind of organizing and constructing it. We originally started with the 6, and naturally we kind of felt they went up to the 3. I think it's more for you to explain to the audience a little bit more on this one.
Certainly pattern development, right? So as we bring it forward, the concepts that we're talking about around data harmonization and consolidation of categories, even though we're counting more categories, we're seeing vendors consolidate within them. Around the topics of unity, from the humanity perspective, we already alluded to this in the concepts of designing for humans. What are those uniquely human motivators that we can design our learning journeys and development pathways around? And then with all this usage of AI, some of the behind the scenes implications and applications for the workforce start to be, how are we driving accountability on the organizational side, the governance, but also in working with providers to remain compliant with new regulations that we're seeing in the marketplace. So again, pulling those 3, unity, humanity, accountability, is there one that kind of sticks out for you on how it defines the expectations for the year ahead?
The biggest one for me is the unity one, because we've got 2 in there, right? One, which is we continue to see, and I think this is going to be the year where there's significant effort around data unification across systems, both internal data across your existing systems, whether it's your HCM, LMS, ATS, right, all that kind of stuff, but also bringing in external data and really figuring out how to do that. And the driver is not only better workforce insights, but also how are we using that data for agentic AI, AI modeling, MCP servers, things like that. So I think that one is going to be something from an HRIT perspective, really critical to be thinking about and kind of planning your budget. From a provider perspective, and also from a client perspective, we're seeing this unification of workforce intelligence. And what gives me pause is we've got about 7 categories that are all starting to kind of market themselves as workforce intelligence. Candidly, they are all equally doing a good job and starting to give those insights, whether it's employee engagement category or strategic workforce planning or learning or people analytics. I mean, we're seeing other ones, and they're all answering the question of what's your population? How are they doing from a skills, engagement, performance management, talent management? Where are your gaps? What should you be doing about it? Well, on the one hand, and I think every one of them kind of feeds and has the ability to answer that question, but it creates 2 issues. One, if I'm a client, I need to very carefully, because I probably have 7 different products for each one of those categories. And I want to watch those categories to figure out, okay, well, can I go down to 3 systems? And it means keeping up with those providers and figuring out where are they in terms of their evolution, things along those lines. So it's kind of piece one. I think the second one for the providers is I'm very concerned about what the market can support from an enterprise perspective. How many vendors can do workforce intelligence, right? Because if you think about skills intelligence, I think all of us, if we kind of rattle off at the beginning of the skills intelligence thing, there was probably less than 10 providers. And there's been a lot of acquisitions. I can only think about 3 that are kind of left that are pure plays. And I'm looking at when those 7 consolidate, that's a lot more than 10. So I think there's an opportunity for merger acquisitions, but I think that's an important watch out this year to see what happens with that category as a whole.
I agree on that unity anchor. I do think that with all the opportunity for transactions in the marketplace, the acquisition side, even the merger opportunity, product launches, and the excitement around tackling the skills challenges that have been vexing leaders over the last 5, 6, even 10 years, is there's not a clear sawball for all of these today, but we're seeing overlap in the amount and proliferation of data in between systems. And as we see large enterprise HR tech stacks continue to grow, there is more of an overlap in terms of just the data resources and even the capabilities. Think again about generative AI and how even different models may reach parity at different levels and trade-off jockeying position one over another. I think that focus starts to shift from, well, how do we add the new capability to our stack, but also think about which vendor we may already have that does it best. I think it's that mindset that could even lead to consolidation, not just of categories, but hopefully simplification of vendor stacks in our clients today. Let's jump right into talking about, well, what are those 6 predictions? So I'll read these top line shorthand quickly for the audience so that they can see the full report themselves. But the 2026 HR technology predictions are: 1, technology will demand data source curation. 2, consolidated systems will break out of their individual silos. 3, voice-assisted user interfaces will accelerate AI adoption. 4, human motivators will shape AI-driven learning journeys. 5, governance and trust will guide HR technology decisions. And 6, dynamic consumption and outcome models will challenge user-based pricing. So it's a quick rattling of all 6 in total. Let's start with the question of most transformative out of those.
I'll give you 2, because the rest of them are, okay, let's see how this plays through, right? But the 2 that I think are transformative is 1, on the human motivators will shape AI-driven learning. I really think this is going to be the year where we're going to see truly personalized learning that is catered to the individual. We know their learning style. We know what their skills gap are. So if you and I took the same class or course, we're going to see different things, whether it's micro-learning, things along that lines. And on the one hand, I'm incredibly excited about that because it makes perfect sense based on skills gap and learning in the flow of work. How do we generate that piece? That's transformative. I think the pause for concern is from a instructional design perspective, kind of from an underpinning in HR profession, this kind of blows up instructional design. If everyone's getting different things, I can do an L1 SAS survey, but I can't do an L4, right? So it's going to be fun seeing how the learning industry deals with that dynamic one. I think the second one is the outcome-based pricing. For all the right reasons, the industry typically, historically, has always been primarily PEPI-based, right? Per employee per year, whether it's PEPM or PEPI, the unit driver is the number of employees. And there's a couple words based on spend, but for the most part, it's the number of employees the company has. As we put in generative AI, what we're seeing now creates a pretty strong variable cost basis inside these companies, right? It used to be, if you did SaaS, you knew what your fixed cost was from a deployment perspective, you knew what your PEPI was, you knew what your consumption was, you could say, here's what my margins. Well, now if you roll out AI, you can have one client generate this much cost, and you can have another client generate this much cost if they adopt it. And the ironic thing is, the more they adopt it, the higher the cost. So the providers are trying to figure out, how do I pass along that pricing? And one of the really large HCMs have come out with variable pricing that they've rolled out, and they're looking at what are you doing in terms of integrations and token use and things like that. And we're seeing other companies starting to try to figure out what their variable-based pricing is. And again, it's for the right reasons on their side. What gives me a very big pause, and I think it's going to be transformative for the industry, is figuring out how many of us in HR, if I did a leave of absence AI agent, do I know how many tokens I'm going to use, and do I know what my adoption rate's going to be? Probably not. And so it's going to create this dynamic where I think we as the HRIT professionals are going to get pushed to try to figure out and size things that historically we've never sized, right? It used to be easy. I have 12,000 employees. And so I think that one, just because of the underlying economics, it's going to force its way into the conversations.
I'd have to agree. I think if we were to use the word transformative as the descriptor for and pick one of these, it would have to be the pricing model disruption. And as we were in the report, we see, again, those two forces that you just described, the value-aligned pricing and the high variability and heating costs that together kind of come to squeeze the traditional fixed fee structures like the user-based pricing. And I think why this feels transformative is because the selling process becomes less about feature overload and answering the questions of, yes, we can also add this capability to our stack, but it's more of the specific business problems being solved, whether it's workforce retention, better talent matching, or improved employee experiences. Any kind of expectations or guidance in terms of preparing and readying that forecasting from a budgeting perspective, what's the ease into this?
One of the things that we've learned in working with clients on SimpliOps, which is the product that we sit behind an HCM that helps with configuration management and things along those lines. One of the things it does an amazing job at is it analyzes all the transaction volumes. And so it was amazing as we worked with clients, people really seeing how many steps and what the transaction volumes are for ESS, MSS, things along those lines. And again, normally you would not expect somebody from HRIT going, okay, what's my transaction volume on MSS, ESS, and is there a way to optimize it? I think tools like SimpliOps are going to be more important for HRIT to really dig into what that consumption looks like, what's driving the consumption, and what can we do it. I think that would be one. And like I said, we've helped clients on how to do this. I think we're going to see it more as we also design agents, right? I mean, the systems are low code agent development, but it's possible to design a good agent that does not consume as many tokens. There's other ones you can design a bad agent that does the exact same thing and it consumes a lot more tokens. So I think that's the other piece that there's going to be a little bit of a learning curve that we help clients on, which is, and there's kind of the expression everyone's calling it tokenomics, right? I'm like, all right, but that's going to be important for us to understand.
I agree. I think as you look at that transaction volume and understanding what and where members of the human and the agentic workforce are doing things today, we get that sense of, well, where are those unified data challenges? And I think that speaks to another one of our predictions here on something we probably spent too much time on. One that has an evergreen component because of it is the demand for data source curation. I'd love to get your perspective on why that makes it a trend in 2026 for our predictions when it seems so evergreen.
I think the reason it's a trend is I think this is kind of the forcing year. A lot of the major systems out there and providers have done an amazing job creating some data partnerships, but they are all within package, right? So you could go to an HCM provider and say, I want external data on my job profiles or my job descriptions, things like that. And you click a button, it shows up inside the system. Because we're starting to see clients and we're working with clients on how do you do an orchestration layer above the systems. So think about leave of absence, where let's say you're talking to your HCM, you're talking to your benefits provider, you're doing your insurance carrier, you're doing ticket management, all of that. It's now going above the system. And so I think there's going to be a bigger push for how do you do that data layer, kind of a data fabric piece across. And again, we've done this with clients, and I think we're going to see a lot more of it this year.
And with good reason too, unleashing the number of agents and generative responses across user experiences. I think even in some of the stats that we see in the report, people analytics is described as a strategic priority, but less than 10% feel like they're mature with aspects around predictive analytics and guidance. Nuance again in 2026 being that curation of how data is presented and available in that fabric to be able to answer questions on process or how to. You don't want your application giving two different answers to explain process involving various talent experiences. So that's certainly something that underpins not just the data, but how it's applied in the applications that we're talking about in HR Tech. As we jump back into the full predictions list, any that we're looking at on the side of the humanity theme. So as we jump back into one of your transformative ones, thinking about the personalized learning journeys that tap into human motivators. How does this shape what we're talking about here?
I think there's going to be a couple things, and I know we talked a little bit about how it's transformer from an end user perspective, right? You're going to get parsed learning, based on what you need, how you want it, in the format that you need, and kind of just in time. That's going to transform the end user experience. If you step back for a second and you go, okay, well, historically, our model has been third-party content aggregators, learning management content management systems, LMSs, and then some sort of LXP consumption layer. And there's kind of varying versions of that stack, but kind of think of it in that regard. And so I think that's the trend and kind of the prediction that we're seeing this year is one, from a HRIT perspective, be thinking about learning, how do you do contextually aware learning development, things along those lines. I think the second one is we ought to be looking at saying, okay, what is your third-party spend on content development? What does that look like? Are we able to generate more? I mean, because the companies, the LMS and the content generation companies are getting a lot better and a lot faster at doing it. One of our major HCMs just bought a fantastic LMS company, and LMS is definitely an understatement, from Europe, and their AI generation is incredibly strong, right? So, I mean, I think that's going to be the year where not only does it affect the end user, but if I'm an HRIT, I'm going to be looking and really studying my stack, right? So is there a way to optimize my third-party spend, things along those lines?
I love doing these podcasts with you, Franz, and every one of these conversations that we get to have, because as your mind goes to the HR tech stack as a reference point, I go to the historical trends in the industry. The learning side, the L&D front, I think about the proliferation of open courses up to 10 years ago, the kind of age of the MOOCs and the colleges virtually opening up their curriculum to the faculty of the masses. But what that age provided in access, I think it lacked in the motivation, which is what we're starting to get into now. And that changed over the last decade as different motivators were tried with gamification principles, using engaging content like videos, competitions, video games. We saw the personalization trend start to get into it with courses around in the flow of learning of content. And certainly in terms of the last few years with expert-led generated content to be like the influencer side of corporate learning. But as we get into this humanized motivation, helping to drive a focus on learning ambitions, looking at, well, what skills are trending and should you take a course that highlights that unique capability that the organization needs by the data that's available within it, helping people actually to learn how they prefer to learn. Do you want to learn audibly in the mode of a podcast like we're listening to now? Is it something that you want that in the voice and tone of your favorite hosts? But is this not just anecdotal? I think about as we look at some of the data from the report, L&D initiatives that do personalize down to the learner level can be between 15 to 30% more efficient and can lead to 20% reduction in turnover of high potential talent. So getting people what they want, but how they want to learn as well. And I think this is something that we certainly can do now and expect to see more of in 26. Extending that further, one of the things we haven't touched on as much is not just personalization in learning, but personalization in voice. So how have we talked about voice starting to be a larger role in user experiences in HR tech?
And this one, it was kind of like, all right, this is either going to be a make it or break it year for it. Because I think several years ago, everyone did try the voice thing, right? And it did work really well. I'm wondering if it was kind of the feature before its time piece. We're starting to see voice come back. One, it's easy to code inside the systems now. It's easier to do voice. The underlying transcription technology has now gotten to the point where it's incredibly accurate. There's not issues in terms of men and women and diversity. That's all gotten really good. If you think about the last couple of years, we've created work environments where we are online, right? We are talking a lot, right? Webcasts, online meetings. And so as a result, us talking to each other creates a framework. Well, I can talk to my computer. If I can participate and not disrupt the work around me, then I should be able to do that, right? So I think the work environment is adjusted where this may be something we could actually pull off now. I think it's going to be interesting. I mean, I was on a briefing yesterday with a payroll company, and they talked and showed that they ran payroll on a smart speaker. And it was fascinating because they were like, Arya, run payroll. And it went, thank you. We are running the payroll. Now, I have to admit, when I was running payroll, that gave me the heebie-jeebies. I was like, wait a minute, I want to see the exception reports, things like that. But it gave an idea of how far they're pushing it. It's not just question and answer. It's could you kick off transactions, which is really cool.
And that's the layer that we're seeing this year, because the past few years, to your point, we've seen plenty of conversational AI simulators where you're practicing maybe having a difficult or a challenging conversation, but to have that be enacting workflows through a voice-assisted agent, that's what we're really excited to see take shape, where treating technology, not just as a team member, but engaging with them as you would a team member. this takes a feel as well to the way that we've engaged with generative AI, of concept of prompt engineering. All talked about courses on how to get better content out of an agent or out of an LLM, but to be able to talk to it in a conversational manner gives that natural voice and validation, and even more crystallizing of what you're actually looking to collaborate on. So a vantage point that we're really excited to see moving forward. And from a physical standpoint, something we saw at the Consumer Electronics Show, actual devices that are listening aids that you can wear as a pendant or as jewelry that becomes part of your operating user interfaces. One last thing to talk about as we get into this is the accountability angle. Why is this such a pressing topic in our prediction set for 2026?
We've got it as government and trust are going to guide our HR technology decisions. We do need to understand that the trust that we build with our employees about how we're using AI is critical. We published a great article in Harvard Business Review showing, that if the employees don't trust the AI, it significantly impacts the adoption. And I know that's common sense, but we statistically in that article can show the correlation between the two. So you're going to have the employee accountability of, you've got to tell me more, right? The second is from an external perspective, the general population is starting to expect more. They expect more transparency in terms of understanding how the data is going to be used. And then the third piece, and I think this governance piece from an enterprise piece is going to be more important for HR and IT to be doing, is really looking at your entire HR landscape and tech stack that you've got. So if you think about what's going on in workforce intelligence, what's going on in learning, what you're doing in terms of the accountability and the movement, we've been spending a lot of time, Kyle Forrest, myself, are working with clients on what their HR strategy is. An important component of that is helping map out their HR technology strategy, because it's moving so quick that two things are happening. One, if a client's not careful, they'll end up spending more than they should. They're missing cost savings due to redundant capabilities, things along those lines. So one, we help with that. But the second is, we know you have to govern as the new features turn on and capabilities, what the AI is going to be and the implications in terms of the employee experience and the risk profile that it does internally and externally. I think as an industry, there's a couple class action suits out there that we're all watching, to kind of see what the implications are. I think even though there may not be any fines coming from the EU yet, the reality is this is the year that we really need to get rigorous about our own internal accountability for all the reasons that I listed.
Yeah, we can't leave a conference like we just left where the theme was AI everywhere and not have those inherent aspects of risks in outcomes, not only measuring for different types of bias, especially when AI is involved, but also the transparency piece that you noted as well, avoiding that black box concerns for talent experiences, both internal and certainly in the job application process as well. As we look to wrap our conversation on predictions for the HR tech space in the year ahead, what early signals are you watching that might shape this wave of predictions as it takes shape this year and influences direction in the HR tech marketplace?
There's two pieces, right? One, what are we seeing on the buying side? It's one thing for companies to be buying new tech, deploying new tech, right? But if the adoption's not there, either just from an internal consumption, people turning it on, we all know sometimes there's industry issues with shelfware, or just the ability to buy into new tech. And so I think continuing to track what we think the HR technology purchasing is going to look like. Now, so far, it looks positive, but I think we'll see what that looks like. I mean, last year had a really weird curve. The year ended up good for everyone, but it had a weird curve, and I'm waiting to see how this plays out for us. I think that's the biggest piece. The second is the liquidity in the market. We're already seeing some merger acquisitions happening. And so the more the assets move through the investors, the more movement we're going to see in terms of companies that were at a B going to a C. And that drives a lot of innovation also, but it also drives some consolidation that's going to be happening. So I think that's going to be the things I want to watch for the next 2 months and see what happens.
Indeed, 2 months and rest of 12 months as we end on that aspect of what to look forward to from transactions and buying patterns. With that, thank you for joining us today as we explored our HR technology marketplace predictions for 2026. Again, focused on those thematic anchors of unity, humanity, and accountability. Please go read the report, map out, as Franz had shared, where those predictions have already started to show up in reality. And please come back to us listeners afterwards to tell us what you think. We look forward to sharing more with you next time. Signing off until then.
Thank you, Matt.
This podcast is produced by Deloitte. The views and opinions expressed by podcast speakers and guests are solely their own and do not reflect the opinions of Deloitte. This podcast provides general information only and is not intended to constitute advice or services of any kind. For additional information about Deloitte, please go to Deloitte.com/about.